Okay. Well, once again, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, and this is Nine Swings, One Home Run, DuPont Business Ideas, 1800 to 1804. So what we'll be talking about here today is how the DuPont family came to America from France right at the turn of the 19th century, loaded with a whole slew, a whole list of ideas for how they might take the money that they've brought with them across the Atlantic and use it to invest in the new United States, use it to create businesses that are intended to make them money, to turn a profit, and to make their fortune in their new homes in the United States. Well, they have nine of these ideas, but one of which really does the trick and sets the family up for the rest of history, as it were. Well, let's dive right in here. So the DuPonts coming to America. Well, they crossed the Atlantic on the Boston-based merchant ship, the American Eagle, which had actually been seized by French forces and kept locked up in the port of La Rochelle for a period of time, was finally released in October of 1799. And amongst the passengers on the ship are the DuPont family, the extended family of the DuPonts, who are coming to America with boundless hopes for what the new world and the new country of the United States might be able to do for them, especially in terms of opportunity to apply their capital accumulation to new business ventures. Well, the crossing is thoroughly miserable. It takes nearly 3 months. The weather is poor. The conditions are bad, especially for the aristocratic DuPonts who are used to comfort that a sea voyage of this type simply can't provide. Nevertheless, the family is buoyed along by the boundless hopes of the patriarch of the family, who has gathered, his family has gathered a pile of capital investment and disembarks finally in New York on New Year's Day, 1800. And bringing with them, they've got, once again, capital investment from partners in France, but also the family's own fortune. And they are coming up with schemes for how to apply this money, how to use this money to create a new life for themselves in America, and ultimately to secure the family's fortune in the future. And here are the nine business plans that the DuPont clan come up with on their way to and upon arriving in America. There's land. As we know, land is one of the major industries in the United States in its early history, where land, of course, seized from expropriated Native American people in different ways, land becomes the ultimate commodity to be bought and traded. Especially in this period, land is the ultimate source of wealth and the ultimate trade good in the early United States. And so that is the premier idea that the DuPonts have when they come over to the United States, that they're going to get involved in the land business. That's not the only idea they have, however. That is the first, the chief amongst them. But they also have multiple schemes for making a living through finance, different kinds of banking and finance businesses. So there are three specific types of banking and financial service industries that they consider getting into. The next plan was to get into the gold smuggling game. And this is a rather interesting intrigue here, where the plan initially was to smuggle gold out of the Spanish Empire and sell it on the market. We'll see how that turns out in the end. Never, needless to say, it's an extremely interesting and intriguing plan, especially given that it's all in sort of cloak and dagger, black market type business. Their next idea was packet service, or regularly scheduled shipment service across the Atlantic between North America, the United States, and France in particular. Another plan was naval stores, or becoming merchants in naval material and supplies, or perhaps becoming a trading house, opening a commercial firm to trade in items between the North America and Europe. And lastly, the ninth and final idea, which was really only included as almost an afterthought by the family, was gunpowder making, because one of the young sons, E.I. DuPont, had exposure to gunpowder making back in France, and we'll come back to this in a moment. But it was sort of tacked on at the very end as the last sort of remaining possibility of how the DuPonts might use their money. So here are the 9 business plans, and let's see how they all shake out. We can probably already begin to guess, given what we know about DuPont, given what we know about the title of this talk, 9 swings and 1 home run. Nevertheless, let's unpack each of these in turn. So the main plan that the DuPonts, especially the patriarch, leader of the DuPont family, had in coming across to the United States was to invest in land, to build a land colony, or to acquire a vast tract of land that they planned to call Pontiana, with the idea of not only land being the ultimate source of wealth, which was all about physiocracy, that comes down here in just a moment, but suffice it to say that the leading economic theory of the day, especially amongst French thinkers, not least of whom DuPont himself, was physiocracy, or the idea that the land is the ultimate source of all wealth and all value, and that to own the land and to develop it is to position oneself at the head of economic development and opportunity. So this idea of Pontiana was to acquire a large tract of land in the Ohio Valley, so beyond the Appalachians, in the West, that was opening rapidly to settlement in this period. And the idea was then to sell pieces of this vast tract, this Pontiana, this land colony in the Trans-Appalachian West, sell pieces of that land to settlers, to colonizers, especially the French. The anticipation being here that the DuPonts could use their connections back to France to encourage immigration to the United States and settlement on this land colony in Pontiana. The idea being that through agricultural development of this land, it would gain value, and so the land itself would increase in value, but also the products of that land would add to the economic value of the property as well. And that brings us back to that physiocracy piece. So this was cutting-edge economic theory for its day, especially coming out of the French context. Well, having landed in New Year's Day 1800, they're arriving right really in the midst of the Panic of 1797, which was an economic panic in the period where capital credit dried up, and the land market, which once again was the basis of trade and wealth in this period, especially speculative wealth and investment in this period, dries up. And once they arrive, the DuPonts are warned away from getting involved in the land market, because land assets are losing value instead of gaining them as a result of this financial panic. And so this plan, which had been the animating goal of the DuPonts coming to America, comes to nothing. Nevertheless, they still have a bunch of other ideas and are undaunted. So that brings us to banking scheme number 1. Remember that there are 3 financial banking and financial service business schemes that the DuPonts have in their portfolio of ideas here. Well, here's the first. Banking scheme number 1 is to become a, quote, branch treasury of France in the United States, such that the privately owned and operated DuPont Bank would be contracted by the French state to perform state financial functions in North America. Of course, this would be entirely in service to empire building, especially, of course, the French imperial interests in the Americas, which in this period are still significant, and positioning themselves in a potentially profitable location within international finance, which is very underdeveloped in this period. But the DuPonts are aware enough, they have enough high-level knowledge of finance to know that there is a potential opportunity here, especially as this international financial system begins to grow. This too comes of nothing. The French government has no interest in opening a branch treasury in the United States, much less in contracting with the DuPonts to do that. Undaunted, it's all right. The DuPonts still have plenty of ideas. So let's see what they come up with next. Well, here is banking scheme number 2. That is to establish a financial clearinghouse in the United States. A clearinghouse is something like an institutional intermediary that performs financial functions between buyers and sellers, between contracting parties in order to settle payments and perform other financial institutions. This is called clearing financial transactions. And the idea here was that the DuPonts, their clearinghouse located in the United States, would serve Franco-American commerce and be able to clear or settle payments made between parties in France and the United States trading across the ocean. Again, the DuPonts are aware enough about the state of international commerce to see that this is a possibility, but it too comes to nothing. Nevertheless, undaunted, the DuPonts continue, and they have yet a third banking scheme. The fact that there's such an emphasis on high finance should give you some sense of how the DuPonts imagined themselves and imagined their future in the United States. Well, the banking scheme number 3 is making loans to the United States government out of their own private access to capital. Of course, the possibility is there because there's a new national government in place in the United States, and one that is eager to borrow from lenders. This was actually a key part of the policy program advocated by Alexander Hamilton and his allies in the founding generation, because national debt is one of the key ways to secure a nation's future. I know we tend to think of that as national debt as a problem, but Hamilton understood that it's actually an asset. So consider, here we have the young United States. It's a new government surrounded by more powerful and more well-established empires and rival states. What the United States needs is allies. And not necessarily political or military allies, although that helps, but anyone who's willing to lend the United States money then has a vested interest in the continued existence and stability and prosperity of the United States so that the government can make good on those loans and pay back that debt. And Hamilton understood this as a key to the future success of the United States. And it's proved to be that case. And so the DuPonts considered, hey, here's a new state looking for financing. We can lend money to the United States. Of course, this is part and parcel of a larger pattern of Franco-American cooperation. In fact, during the Revolution, the French kingdom comes in to the aid of the American revolutionaries in their struggle against the British Empire. You can argue, and I would argue, that the American Revolution would have failed if it hadn't been for direct material support from France, as well as the Dutch and a couple of other European allies, but especially France. And so this willingness to lend money to the young United States was part and parcel of the history of Franco-American cooperation and alliance. Be that as it may, this scheme too came to nothing. The United States was uninterested in this deal, and whether the deal was even fully offered, I'm not entirely sure. I wasn't able to track down all of the documents here. But suffice it to say, neither here nor there, this scheme too comes to nothing. Okay, so the DuPonts are disappointed in their scheme to build a land colony. They're disappointed in their multiple plans to establish banks or financial services firms. What's another way that they can nevertheless exploit their knowledge and their connections to high-level capital circulation and state activity? Well, here's the Spanish gold scheme, by which the DuPonts make secret plans with their partners and financiers back in Europe to extract gold from the Spanish Empire and to sell it on the market. This is dependent upon a state of war with Spain, by which the normal licit flow of gold out of the Spanish Empire into the world market has been interrupted. And so the idea here is this state of war creates an opportunity for smuggling, for the illicit trade of gold out of the empire, which was expressly against Spanish imperial regulations, which for centuries up to this point had strictly controlled the export, especially of gold and silver, out of the Spanish Empire. Well, that once again creates sort of a black market smuggling opportunity where during this time of war, you can skirt Spanish imperial regulations and smuggle gold out of the empire and trade it on the world market. Well, before they can get started on these secret plans, peace breaks out. And this breakout of peace completely foils the plan. And so this plan too comes to nothing. But again, I think not only is it a sort of a colorful anecdote, but it's also really revealing of not only the DuPont's connections to and awareness of these large global economic and political situations, but shows how they consider themselves to be relevant as actors within that very high-level international system of affairs. Well, the next series of business ideas are somewhat more practical, a little bit more removed from the thin air of high finance and more connected to the actual functioning of the economy on a material level. One of these ideas was to establish a packet line or a packet service of regularly scheduled shipping between France and the United States. This would, in this period, would mark an innovation. Yes, there is shipping going on across the Atlantic, but it is not regularly scheduled. It's highly dependent on the whims of the market, the whims of the weather, the whims of the individually owned and operated ships. This would be different. This would be an approach by which the DuPont firm would own their own fleet of vessels that they would operate regularly so that a shipper in France or the United States would know reliably that they'd be able to ship goods, people, etc., between the two locations on a regularly scheduled basis. An innovation which does, in fact, eventually take place and does make people money. Not in this case, however. The crux of the DuPont's plan for this packet service, this Franco-American packet line, was to secure the contract to be the official mail carrier for France, to be the official carrier of mail for the French state between France and the United States. They failed to secure this contract. The idea of providing freight and passenger service, however potentially profitable, falls through, and this too comes to nothing. The next of the DuPont business plans was to become dealers in naval stores, or this is supplies and materiel for ships, specifically naval material for the French fleet in North America, especially based in Saint-Domingue, what is today's Haiti. And of course, this is this period right before the Haitian Revolution, where Saint-Domingue, Haiti, is still a French colony and one of the crown jewels of the French Empire, especially in North America. Um, these naval stores include turpentine, rosin, tar, pitch, hemp, rope, lumber, etc., all of which could be secured in North America at globally competitive prices. So there was certainly a valid business opportunity here, and one that they are able to seize upon. They establish this business. They secure a contract with the French government to supply these naval stores to the French fleet in North America. Unfortunately, once they've invested in this business, once they've bought the materials and sold them on and provided them to the French fleet, a new regime in Paris refuses the bill. And so the DuPonts are left holding the bag on this naval stores scheme where they've invested, even gone into the business, even provided the products to their customer. And now the French government won't pay the bill. And so this is a major step back, a major setback for the DuPonts, because they're left out in the cold, having spent this important piece of their limited investment capital, and now they're unable to secure payment. And so this is a real problem, and it leads them, the family, and their partners to abandon this plan. The next, and next to last, idea for the DuPonts to get into business and to make money in the United States was to become a trading house, to effectively become merchants and to engage in transatlantic commerce. This scheme was favored by Victor Marie DuPont, who's the oldest of the two sons, who secured permission from his father and from his father's partners to get involved in this scheme. And he immediately acquires real estate warehouses in New York City and in Alexandria, Virginia. New York City is an obvious choice. It is, even in this early period, a very important trade center and one of the leading locations for commerce in the young United States, and looks very clearly set to become even more important as a trading location. However, in New York, foreigners are not allowed to own property outright. And so they buy invest in a second location, a second warehouse in Alexandria, Virginia, or what is now Virginia, and was then in the newly laid out District of Columbia. And Alexandria looked set to become the center of commerce, the important trading center for the new National Capital District of Columbia. And so both of these made good sense insofar as they were locations for trade. However, this real estate was very expensive. This real estate was a premium cost real estate, especially because of the advantages clearly inherent in these locations. And it's a substantial part of the entire liquid capital available to the DuPonts put into the purchase of these warehouses for trading. The idea here is that French and American merchants would be encouraged to engage in trade through the DuPont Trading House. Victor Marie himself had been a diplomat to the United States and had contacts back in France, and certainly there was potential there, potential to use those connections and that exposure to engage in and facilitate this profitable trade. Unfortunately, it doesn't come to that. In fact, this scheme is a financial ruin. Victor Marie is not a gifted merchant. The firm is unable to translate its contacts into sufficient business to actually break even, much less make a profit. And this scheme results in financial ruin. And the family and their partners are left wondering what to do with their very limited store of capital left. Well, that's where the ninth idea comes in, and this one's a home run. This one actually makes the family's fortune, and that is gunpowder making. Gunpowder making was favored by Eleuthère Irénée Dupont, who, on a hunting trip along the Brandywine, which was home to a small but nevertheless significant French expat community in this period, on a hunting trip, Eleuthère EI encounters American-made gunpowder and realizes that it is very inferior to the European article, that its manufacturer, he goes to see the local gunpowder mill and finds that they're using production techniques that had been abandoned in France more than a century before. And nevertheless, that this really inferior American-made gunpowder cost more than you could buy European powder for in Europe. And so this gives E.I. DuPont the idea that here's a profit-making opportunity because he had direct experience with gunpowder making. He actually worked for the Bureau of Powders and Saltpeters in France during this time. He wasn't directly involved in the powder making process necessarily. He was a clerk. He was more involved in the administrative side, but that nevertheless gave him sufficient exposure to gunpowder making. And this is the key, the most advanced techniques in gunpowder making in the world at that time, gives him the idea that if he were to apply these advanced manufacturing techniques to gunpowder in the United States, he'd be able to make a higher quality product than rivals within the market and sell it at a vastly profitable price, given how expensive powder was in the United States. E.I. DuPont plans this business initiative in great detail. And Hagley has documents that show the planning in minute detail. And it's really quite interesting to see how E.I. synthesizes the high-level view with the very micro view of details. And the ability to bridge that gap between the macro and micro takes a certain amount of intellectual flexibility that E.I. shows in this process, where he's planning so carefully to locate the perfect location in the United States to build his gunpowder mills and his new firm, but also how to position that firm within a widening national market and an international market. And it's that ability to balance the local and global that helps prove E.I. a rather clever fellow and helps prove this gunpowder making venture a success. Well, the newly organized E.I. DuPont firm is funded by a mix of French and American capital investment and gets started in 1804, making powder. I'll elaborate a bit by mentioning, as Roger helpfully mentioned up at the beginning here, the fall line, which is a geological feature where the Piedmont and the Tidewater adjoin one another, where rivers running out of Appalachia down to the Atlantic fall about 200 vertical feet down this fall line escarpment. And this fall line is an absolutely critical feature and location for economic activity throughout history. One might perhaps especially emphasize, however, this early industrial period where water power is so critical and water transportation are so critical. And so E.I. locates his gunpowder mills on the fall line, on the Brandywine, after having looked at fall line milling communities between Pennsylvania and Virginia, and chooses the Brandywine for a couple of reasons. One, because of that fall line water power, which on the Brandywine is very reliable, as well as the local society, which he enjoyed. He had friends of French expats who already lived in the area. And that was the ultimate reason the DuPonts ended up in Delaware on the Brandywine. And this gunpowder making venture, of course, is a home run. So we've had 9 swings, 8 were misses, but this last one cracks it out of the park. And this is a home run. This is the E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, which is extremely successful. Initially makers of gunpowder and blasting powder, DuPont enjoys early success by securing government contracts for their gunpowder. And DuPont gains a reputation in the United States military for creating a very high grade and very reliable product. And those government contracts for gunpowder, but also for blasting powder, because let's not forget that throughout the 19th century, people in America and the United States are building railroads, they're building mines, they're doing all these things that require blasting powder as well as gunpowder. And so the DuPonts are able to make money from government and public and private contracts for their powder and make real money. But they don't stop there. As a lot of us perhaps in this Zoom room are well aware, DuPont becomes a center of technical innovation and the application of technical innovation to business. And so this is where R&D, or research and development, comes in. This is where DuPont over time invests very heavily in fundamental research, because new scientific and technical breakthroughs, innovations, can find profitable business applications. And the DuPont ethos of being at the cutting edge of science and then applying that to business has characterized the firm nearly to the present. Of course, Uncle Dupy lasted from 1802, first powder created in 1804. And then, of course, the corporation was radically changed and restructured in 2017. And of course, the legacy of the firm and its products lives on in many different ways. And that, of course, is the ultimate legacy of the DuPont family and firm. And the sort of end of this story of how the DuPonts came to the United States, had 9 ideas for how to make money. 8 of them failed, but 1 was a success. And it was such a success that the DuPont name is familiar to us to this day and stands out in American history, especially perhaps American business history. Thank you very much.
Hey, that's great, Greg. There's lots of questions. First, I should give Greg a hand for that talk there. A lot covered in half an hour, 40 minutes in all, so it is very efficient. But we've got lots of questions here in the chat. And Greg, maybe you want to go down them, one by one, or I can read them to you. Some of it is simply, backdrop to the family there. There's a lot about the DuPont family that people want to ask. And then once we get through those, we can take some more questions from people who are watching.
Terrific. I'll go ahead and read the questions in the chat here. How much money did they bring? Terrific question. I'm not entirely sure, so I'll just say I don't know. Suffice it to say that they had both a personal fortune and then extensive contacts back in France and in very short order within the United States. And there's those contacts that they're able to use for capital investment, especially once their own funds start to run low, which happens after Victor Murray's trading house scheme falls through. Next question. Why call it Pontiana? Well, I think that's just sort of the uh, uh, the rich and powerful person's desire to name big things after themselves. And so this DuPont is where the Pontiana comes from. And I think it's just the idea that this is the land of the DuPonts. It is Pontiana. Um, I'm not sure that there's any more to it than that. Um, let's see, how many came? How many men and many women? Great question. Again, I'm not quite sure off the top of my head of the exact answer, and I don't want to just estimate. It was something like between 7 and 10 individuals, including the DuPonts, the father and the two sons' wives, and a small number of the extended family. But beyond that, I couldn't say for sure. That's a good question, though. Thank you. Let's see. Weren't they running for their lives at the start of the French Revolution? Really good question. So the French Revolution initially begins in 1789. So that's a number of years prior to their leaving France. And you're exactly right. The DuPonts, just like many aristocrats in the context of the French Revolution, face severe political pressure and ultimately arrest. EI himself spends time in jail because of this aristocratic background and not least his politics. He was very vocal and ran a newspaper about his political opinions, which often ran contrary to the revolutionary authorities. And so by the time they leave in 1799 and arrive in the New Year's Day, 1800, the revolution has already it hasn't completely run its course, but it's well on its way. In fact, 1799 or 98, there's Napoleon assumes power. So by now, they're no longer in the reign of terror or the revolutionary regime anyway. And so they're no longer fleeing the revolution as such, so much as they are seeking greater opportunities and the ability to recreate their aristocratic lifestyle as they had known it in the Ancien regime in the United States. And I think it's really telling that this French aristocratic family sees the United States as an opportunity to reestablish an aristocratic lifestyle, even though the United States is nominally organized along a Republican basis. So that's a really interesting question and an important historical context here. Did they become American citizens right away? Was that difficult at the time? I mentioned foreigners are not allowed to buy property in New York, which seems strange in a city of immigrants. Great question. So they do become American citizens. I'm not sure if I would say it was difficult. Part of the pathway to citizenship at the time was property ownership, however. And so that became a little bit difficult when you were a foreign citizen, so you couldn't acquire property, therefore you couldn't become a citizen. So it depended where you were located. So for example, in New York, it was harder than compared to in Virginia, where foreigners were allowed to acquire property, and that actually eased their path to citizenship. Let's see, please repeat about the geology of the fall line and why did the Brandywine provide so much power? Great, sure. So I could go on about this at great length, so you have to tell me to stop. So the geology of the fall line. Make this as brief as I possibly can. So
you've got lots of time. So
great.
Don't be afraid to explain. This is really important. And it's not simple. So don't be afraid to take a minute to explain what's involved here.
Great. I will then. So tens of millions of years ago, North America, the Appalachian Mountains were like the Himalayas are today. So imagine the Appalachian that are so old that they were once as big as the Himalayas and are now the size they are now. Well, that's because tens of millions of years of erosion has worn them down, but all of that eroded material had to go somewhere. So imagine here the edge of the continent, the ancient North American continent, was located where the fall line is now. And if you're not quite sure where the fall line is, just think about the I-95 corridor. because I-95 runs directly atop of the fall line all the way from New York City down to North Carolina. So there's over 600-mile stretch where that's right on top of the fall line. So it's right there. So imagine that was actually the coast. And the entire tidewater, or the flat, geologically young region between the fall line and today's coast, well, that is all of that material that was eroded from the Appalachian Mountains and run down to the sea and forms the tidewater. Well, the fall line, therefore, is the boundary between this ancient body of rock we call the Piedmont and the Appalachian region, and the much geologically younger, flatter, and less rocky tidewater region. And so rivers flowing down from Appalachia to the sea reach the fall line, which is the escarpment, the old edge of the continent, and then tumble down 200 vertical feet down to the tidewater, where they then flow as tidal rivers to the sea. And so that boundary is really important. That fall line becomes absolutely critical to any economic activity that is associated with water in any way. So, for example, let's say you're shipping on these rivers that intersect the fall line. Well, you're going to have to break shipment at the fall line in order to portage. Get out and either carry your ship around the falls or completely transship and move your goods and people to a different mode of shipment above or below the falls. So that's a reason that it's so significant in commerce. It's also significant in manufacturing because that fall of water, that descent of the water 200 vertical feet, creates a head of power, or power that can be tapped into when wheels are established to allow the water power to provide energy to manufacturing facilities. And it's because the water is tumbling over that 200 vertical feet in a relatively short number of miles that creates that water power. And the Brandywine is such a great example of this because not only does it have this fall and this potential energy, therefore, but also it has a very regular and consistent rate of flow. So lots of streams have highly variable rate of flow throughout the year, where seasonal changes in rainfall make the availability of water power higher or lesser during different parts of the year. And the Brandywine has the advantage of having consistently available levels of water power throughout the year. And so without going into any more detail on that's what made it so attractive to DuPont and other investors like the DuPonts who wanted to make money, who had capital to invest. And the fall line was one of the really profitable locations to do that because of this density of resources.
Great. Just for all of you, that's his dissertation in 5 minutes, the kind of core of that argument there. He's working on getting into a book form. Someday you'll hear more about that, but that's the short of it. But you're talking to an authority about the impact of geology and economics on this region here. All right, so we got more questions here, though. Let's see.
So it says, where did the DuPonts live prior to the startup of the gunpowder business? New York, Philadelphia, somewhere else? Initially they live, they come in through New York City, and they initially live in northern New Jersey, just on the New Jersey side of the river. But that doesn't last very long before they then relocate down to Delaware. This is fun fact: the Kirkwood Highway follows the fall line between Wilmington and Newark. Yes, exactly right. And not only that, but both Wilmington and Newark exist where they are located because of the fall line, because of their relationship to that fall line. Here in Newark, where I'm located at the moment, the initial paper mills and textile mills that were established here in the late 17th and early 19th centuries are here because they're exploiting fall line water power. Same with Wilmington. Wilmington has the additional advantage of being located right where the fall line allows for water power, and their location close to tidal rivers allows for commerce. And so that combination of commerce and manufacturing right in location, of course, underwrote the Wilmington's economy for hundreds of years and continues to inform our economy to this day, even though our relationship with water is fundamentally different. Can you address the last two major reorganizations and divestitures of DuPont? I'm afraid I can't. My expertise is entirely before the 21st century. What I can hazard to say, though, is that because of DuPont's significance to the local economy over the very long term, even relatively minor changes within the firm have major repercussions on our local community and our economy. So suffice it to say that the relatively major changes that have taken place in the 21st century have had commensurately large impacts on our local community. Do you know when and with what thing or product they first diversified beyond gunpowder? Love the geology stuff. Well, thank you. That's a really terrific question. And I'm not entirely sure how to answer that. I would say that during World War I, the DuPont firm begins to diversify how the types of armaments that they're actually applying their gunpowder expertise to. And so that early 20th century context is where that shift begins to take place. One of the rather famous things first developed by the DuPonts for World War I was tracer rounds, or bullets that glow, so that when you're having a firefight at night in the dark, you can see where you're shooting. Well, they weren't able to scale up production of this technology before World War I ended, but that same technology becomes applied and has a real tactical and strategic significance in the Second World War, which is a legacy of DuPont's willingness, readiness, and ability to innovate, to conduct research, to try and expand their product offerings. What was the reorganization with DuPont that happened after 2017? Well, once again, that's not really my area of expertise. However, I understand that there was a very aggressive attempt by private capital to muscle in and take over management of the firm. And of course, private capital's modus operandi is to move in, acquire assets, and strip firms for parts. And I imagine that was the plan by the folks led by Nelson Peltz, who were attempting and had been beaten off, of course, but only at the cost of making sacrifices that to appease shareholders. So beyond that, I couldn't really say, but that's sort of the boardroom level drama that happened that year.
I want to jump in about the question about the DuPont's diversification in the early 20th century. There's a lot of reasons, a lot of things that are going on then. One is that the powder yards here in Hagley, where I am, they were kind of old by that time, and they weren't very profitable, and DuPont needed to do something else to make money. So there's innovations in smokeless powder and other things that they do. But they become interested in doing more with chemistry and becoming less of an armaments company and more of a chemical company there. And so one of their first expansions, if you will, is into rayon. A rayon, which is basically a wood products. And they experimented in clothing in the 1920s. They work with actually French companies that are related. So it's an effort to take the chemistry, the knowledge they have, and create science-based products, which could then be sold in other venues besides war. It accelerates in the 30s when you have a lot of criticism of DuPont in the hearings in the early 30s by the Nye Committee called the Merchants of Death hearings. And DuPont did not like being called the Merchants of Death. And that's when they go out there and work with advertising agencies for a new slogan called Better Things for Better Living Through Chemistry. So it's an evolution over the course of the early 20th century for that. Of course, Pierre Pont is critical in that. He's a leading figure in the company during that time period. But that's really that transition. It takes place over a few decades for that to happen.
Thank you, Roger.
Sure. There's more questions.
Yeah, EI studied with famous French chemist, Lavoisier. And the sort of family mythology is that EI studied with Lavoisier and learned how to make powder and learned about chemistry from Lavoisier, but that's actually not true. EI didn't study chemistry. He was a clerk in Lavoisier, the office that Lavoisier ran. But Lavoisier is much more involved, of course, with the chemistry, with the hands-on aspect of the powder making process, and the what we now call QA/QC, or quality assurance, quality control. And it's that approach, a sort of, admittedly, a primitive, early modern version of QA/QC that Lavoisier had applied using his expertise in chemistry. And that is that ethos that EI adopts and applies to his firm, this sort of QA/QC, where we're going to attempt to assure and control the quality of our product in order to assure its market share. Let's see. Were they confident they could find the workers they needed and access to the materials they needed when they located the powder mills here? Great question. Yes, exactly. That's one of the key reasons for the location they eventually chose. It was for access to the inputs, the materials necessary for gunpowder making, some of which came from overseas, and therefore you wanted to have access to deep water shipping. But of course, you need abundant water power as well. Deep water shipping tends to be a coastal economic activity, whereas water power, especially in this region, is much more abundant inland. And the one location where you have economical access to both deep water shipping and inland water power is the fall line, right where these two geological regions come together and join one another, right where you've got both water power and deep water shipping access right in the same place. And it's that combination that allowed EI to access the materials from overseas as well as locally, the power necessary. The workers is a rather interesting piece here. Eventually, the DuPont firm takes a preference for employing Irish workers, Irish immigrant labor. And whether that was a comment on the availability of local labor, I'm not entirely sure. But nevertheless, accessing sufficient labor was never a problem, and they're able to do that from the start. What is saltpeter? Well, it's a nitrate that is an essential ingredient in gunpowder. So the early gunpowder ingredients are saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. And you combine these in a very specific ratio, and you can create gunpowder. And of course, each of these things have their own chemical characteristics, and you need a rather sophisticated understanding of their chemistry in order to reliably create the high quality gunpowder that was the object of this business initiative. And so that's where this chemical expertise in chemistry comes in. It's a piece of the DuPont gunpowder business from the very beginning, and it's that which they're able to then, as Roger was just explaining, build upon into the 20th century as the basis for new business opportunities beyond gunpowder. Did they have any competition early on? Yes, when they first got started, there were 2 gunpowder mills operating in the United States. There had been others that had opened and closed over time, but at that moment, there were 2 operating, one of which had a contract with the federal government for supplying powder. And they're able to beat this competition through the quality of their product. And they're able to produce a European quality gunpowder in the United States. And that secures for them those government contracts that had been going to their earlier competition, which was a place called Frankfurt, the Frankfurt Powder Works in southeast Pennsylvania there. And it's on the basis of the quality of their product that they're able to outcompete that competition and really establish themselves as the leader. One of the pieces of national economic development and policy in the United States in this period is import substitution industrialization, or building manufacturing capacity so that goods could be made in the United States instead of bought and shipped in from overseas. And the DuPont gunpowder firm is a perfect example of this import substitution industrialization, by which they're able, once again, to make European quality powder in the United States and therefore outcompete their local competition and their international competition. And it is through that advantage that the company really gets its start. Lots of questions, lots of interest in the subject. Yes, thank you. It's great. But where do they get each of the gunpowder ingredients? So initially, the charcoal comes from willow, and is willow wood, tree from wood from willow trees that is turned into charcoal. Apparently, it has just the right light consistency to provide for good charcoal for gunpowder, much better than other types of wood for the charcoal. Precisely why that is, I'm not entirely sure. They use sort of qualitative descriptors to explain what makes willow better. But suffice it to say, that was another advantage of their location, because willow trees prefer wet soils, and so having access to lowland forested areas and provided enhanced access to willow trees, which provided enhanced access to this high quality charcoal that was necessary. In fact, it was one of the gendered jobs in the powder mills that were assigned to women, was working with the willow tree materials in order to like strip the bark and prepare the wood for being turned into charcoal. And it wasn't long before all of the willow trees around Wilmington had been gone into the powder yards, and they were shipping in willow from farther and farther away. But this, once again, is why it's so important to have access to that cheap, affordable, deep water shipping, because they're able then to move products in affordably, including charcoal from willow trees. The saltpeter was initially coming from I don't want to get my things. I believe the saltpeter was initially coming from India. So again, having to be shipped from halfway around the world in this case. And of course, because the British had colonial control over the Indian market in this period, you needed permission from the British to ship saltpeter to the United States. And so that created a diplomatic problem at some times. In any event, once again, that's why it's important to have affordable access to overseas shipping. And the sulfur, I'm sorry, but I can't recall exactly where I was coming from at this moment. Suffice to say, the origin of these materials changes over time as access to different world regions becomes more or less economical, and as the chemistry, the understanding of the chemistry involved advances. Eventually, they're able to replace saltpeter with sodium nitrate, which was sourced domestically, and that was not only less expensive, but also more reliable in terms of the inputs.
Wow, Greg, that was outstanding.
Thank you.
That was a peppering you with questions, I think would be the word for that. Any more questions for Greg? Oh.
A very, very sincere thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you. I see Bill has reminded us that the sulfur was from Sicily. initially. Thank you, Bill. Yeah, Bet and Maurice.
Hi, great program, great presentation. Could you explain again how they transferred their wealth to the United States, or how they had access to that amount of money to go through eight different attempts to make money?
That's a great question. I couldn't say for sure in this specific case because I lack the documents. However, there were various financial instruments used even for hundreds of years prior to this point for transferring large amounts of money over long distances without actually having to carry the money or the equivalent in gold or silver, what have you, such as a bill of exchange. So a person could, it's operating a little bit like a check. A person, one of their investors, could fill out a bill saying that this person, I'm granting them such and such amount, this bill of exchange is worth such and such an amount. And that person then can carry that piece of paper across the ocean, for example, and then take it to a bank or a clearinghouse or other financial services location in North America, and then cash it in, so to speak, and to use that bill of exchange to either secure access to the money or to use it in place of the money. It can represent the value of money inscribed upon it. And so it is through these sort of financial instruments that people are able to send money around the world without actually having to ship bales of cash.
It's an old challenge for I mean, go back to the 10th century, they're doing this, and that's the origin of paper currency, is having these bills of exchange. And of course, whether you accepted them was a matter of the kind of reputation of the people who issued those bills of exchange. It's not like they were dollar bills backed by a reliable government. They were simply pieces of paper that were signed by individuals or banks whose reputations essentially were the reason why they would have some value. It's a sort of feature of the 19th century economy, too, that there is no national currency in the United States until after the Civil War, the greenback. And so, in a way, you have all the paper that circulates, which has value because people trust the value of that paper, rather than actually have a case where the currency is backed by the faith and the value of the United States. Well, I think you should all give Greg a hand for this tour de force here of the presentation and all that. We're fortunate that Greg works here, so you'll see him again. And I want to thank you all for tuning in and watching our show here today about the DuPonts and how they hit upon a business plan. I'll just say one reason I really like this presentation is that it shows you that it takes a lot of trial and error for people to be successful. And failure comes before success. And that's probably more true than the actual idea that people who are successful just have a great idea, they go and do it, and they don't have any problems doing it. Probably not. And Greg kind of brings this out to you. So thanks all, and come back again next week for another one of our Hagley Does History.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Roger.
Thank you, Gregory. Wonderful. That was great.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Roger. Well, I will see you later.
Okay, I'll see you later, Greg.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.